Dear President of the World Bank Group, David Malpass, dear Chairman of the Board of Julius Baer Group, Romeo Lacher, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to the University of Zurich. We are here for this evening at the invitation of the Europe Institute and our partner Julius Baer Group that supports this lecture series. The Europe Institute is one of the leading centers for expertise on European law in Switzerland. Since 2005, the Europe Institute regularly organizes the Churchill Lectures with prominent representatives of international politics and business, including, for example, and we've heard it in the introduction of Andy Kellerhals already, Henry Kissinger, Helmut Kohl, Anders Rasmussen, José Manuel Barroso, Jean-Claude Juncker, Mark Rutte, and many, many others. These lectures, as the name suggests, are dedicated to former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to commemorate his visit to the University of Zurich in 1946. In his historic Zurich speech, Churchill called for the creation of a kind of United States of Europe. Now I'm citing from his speech. I'm now going to say something that will astonish you. The first step in the recreation of the European family must be a partnership between France and Germany. In this way only can France recover the moral and cultural leadership of Europe. There can be no revival of Europe without a spiritual great France and a spiritually great Germany. The structure of the United States of Europe, if well and truly built, will be such as to make the material strength of a single state less important. Small nations will count as much as large ones and gain their honor by their contribution to the common sense. The ancient states and principalities of Germany, freely joined together for mutual convenience in a federal system, might take their individual places among the United States of Europe. This vision was essential for European post-war politics and ultimately laid the foundation for the European Union. We are facing similar challenges on a worldwide scale nowadays. It is a time of overlapping global crises. The war in the Ukraine, inflation, the economic and social impact of COVID-19, climate change, debt, and fragility and conflict in many other countries. It is therefore very timely to hear the view of David Malpass on building peace, security, and prosperity. It is my honor to introduce shortly today's guest to you. David Malpass was selected as 13th President of the World Bank Group by its Board of Executive Directors on April 5th, 2019. He previously served as Undersecretary of Treasury for International Affairs for the United States and represented the United States in international settings, including the G7 and G20 Deputy Financial Ministerial, World Bank, IMF Spring and Annual meetings, and meetings of the Financial Stability Board, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. Well, I could go on with a very long list, but I would like to conclude my introductory note by thanking Markus Notter and Andreas Kellerhals and the team of Europe Institute for organizing these events and also this event. President Malpass, it is a great pleasure to welcome you at the University of Zurich. We are truly honored to have you here and hope you enjoy your stay in Zurich. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vice President Schwarzenegger, and also thank you, Director Kellerhaus, for the very warm welcome today to myself and my family. It's a deep honor to join you at the University of Zurich, the site of Winston Churchill's historic 1946 speech, delivered at another time of great consequence for Europe and the world. When Sir Winston spoke here in 1946, the world was emerging from years of devastating war and genocide. Tens of millions of people had been killed in one of the worst atrocities of our history. Millions more had fled their homelands as refugees, seeking safety and sustenance. The European economy was in ruins and its fabric was torn, leaving people in need of food, jobs, and hope for the future. In his address to this institution, the former Prime Minister provided a vision for Europe that helped inspire decades of peace, safety, and growth on the continent. As Europe now relives the tragedy of war, Churchill's call to recreate the European fabric and to provide it with a structure under which it can dwell in peace, in safety, and in freedom is more urgent than ever. Within 9 months of Churchill's speech here, the World Bank made its first loan to rebuild Europe. Last week, we marked the 75th anniversary of that loan. It was a reconstruction loan to France to help lay the groundwork for the continent's renewed growth and development. We hope to do the same for Ukraine. As in 1946, war sharpens our focus on the value of prompt action and effective international cooperation. Today, I also want to bring acute attention to the world's overlapping development crises. People in developing countries are suffering from severe reversals in poverty, health, and education, from a loss of access to food, fertilizer, and fuel, and perhaps worst of all, from inequality and significantly diminished prospects for personal advancement and growth. I will focus on the war in Ukraine and its implications for energy and food, the global crisis of inflation, inequality, and debt, and the World Bank Group's evolving role in addressing these challenges, climate change, and global public goods. Like you, I have been horrified and dismayed by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the atrocities committed against civilizations, and the economic losses across the globe. I grew up in the heart of the Cold War, when conflict with the Soviet Union was our nightmare. For millions of people, outright war has become their reality. The damage to Ukraine, which worsens by the day, has been catastrophic. Lives lost, people's livelihoods, homes, and basic economic needs destroyed, millions of refugees, damage to buildings and critical infrastructure, and severe threats to international security. Churchill spoke here 76 years ago about Europe's human tragedy. He spoke of bewildered human beings who wait in the ruins of their cities and homes and scan the dark horizons for the approach of some new form of tyranny or terror. His words apply today to Ukrainians. Our estimates show $4 billion of physical damage per week, with the human toll on families and society greater still. Just as President Ronald Reagan demanded that Soviet Russia tear down the Berlin Wall, the world now demands that Russia end the war. The World Bank Group's goal upon Russia's invasion was to respond immediately and decisively. Since the start of the war, the World Bank has quickly dispersed over $500 million and mobilized more than $4.5 billion to finance healthcare, pensions, and wages of public servants. We have supplemented our own financing with grants, guarantees, and parallel financing from development partners. Many of our major shareholders, including Switzerland, have participated in these supplements. Through IFC and MIGA, our private sector arm and insurance arms, we provided working capital and insurance to finance food and other supplies flowing into Ukraine. We're also working to help displaced Ukrainians who have become refugees, both inside and outside their country. I visited Warsaw and Bucharest in March. While there, I met with refugees and school children and saw the vital connections among Europeans caring for each other. The support from people who have opened their homes was invaluable in helping Eastern Europe absorb millions of refugees in a matter of weeks. Sadly, Ukrainians and Russians are not the only people suffering violence and conflict. Globally, the number of people living in conflict areas nearly doubled from 2007 to 2020. In the Middle East and North Africa, 20% of people live in an area affected by conflict. Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey are home to refugee camps for millions of Syrians afraid to return home. Similarly, millions of Rohingya live in Bangladesh after violent expulsions from Myanmar. Conflict and refugee flows have become a core challenge for development. The World Bank Group has greatly expanded our engagement with fragile countries around the world, including with more loans and grants, an increased physical presence, and through our work with partner agencies such as the World Food Program. Churchill called, and I know we have a former president of the ICRC here tonight. I don't see him. And thank you very much. We work closely with the International Committee on the Red Cross. Churchill called for a European continent that could simultaneously build its infrastructure and nations of freedom and democracy. We can imagine his many emotions at Europe's results. He would have been proud of Europe's economic success and gratified by the caring spirit Europe is showing for Ukrainian refugees. He was rightly dismayed when an Iron Curtain descended across the continent, and would have been elated by the fall of the Berlin Wall and the demise of Soviet communism, which controlled people through fear and scarcity. We can imagine that Churchill would have stood firmly against dependence on Russian pipelines. Just as solidifying Europe and rebuilding it were of great consequence after World War II, a solid energy vision is vital now for Europe's growth, Ukraine's reconstruction, as well as for global development. Reducing dependence on Russia's coal, oil, and natural gas will require time, innovation, and huge investments. Some of the groundwork is in place. Europe is taking steps to expand the use of liquefied gas, natural gas, and nuclear power. These will be critical for electricity baseload if the latest upswing in coal burning is to be reversed. Securing more sources of cleaner, non-intermittent energy is necessary to maintain Europe's electricity grids, especially as renewables are added. Norway is finishing an important gas pipeline to Poland, a necessary step before adding renewables there. Italy recently agreed to increase its natural gas imports from Algeria by 40%, taking advantage of Algeria's estrangement from Morocco and an underutilized pipeline beneath the Mediterranean. Other possible stabilizers for Europe include quickly finishing Germany's new LNG offloading terminals, connecting Iberia to Europe's grids, upgrading Eastern Europe's electricity grids to absorb renewables, and developing natural gas reserves in Europe, the Eastern Mediterranean, and Africa. Looking beyond Europe, we should recognize that the energy trade-offs made in Europe will have major consequences for developing countries. Natural gas and other sources of energy are a vital input to fertilizer, farm machinery, and the transport of agricultural goods. For the 800 million people living without electricity, the impacts of the war are taking energy access even further out of their reach, delaying reading lights, clean water, digitalization, and the vital information flow that comes through internet access. As Europe absorbs more resources, it affects the availability of energy, electricity, and food around the world, making new energy supplies an imperative for Europe and the world. For now, LNG capacity is constrained at each point by the limited supply of gas and pipelines, compression and decompression facilities, and ocean shipping. Gas flaring, methane leakage, and the operation of antiquated coal-fired power plants with severe health and climate impacts continues with little abatement. Already, the high price of LNG is causing an increased use of coal, diesel, and heavy fuel oil, including across Africa. In sum, global energy supplies must expand to depend less on Russia and more on new, cleaner energy. There will also need to be a concerted effort by the major economies to reduce government subsidies for using energy, increase energy efficiency, reverse the trends toward diesel generators and biofuels such as ethanol, and make major new investments in electricity and pipeline grids and midstream natural gas. Let me turn to the problem of inflation. The impact of inflation hits the poor the hardest and is materially worsening the reversals in development that appeared during COVID. Each step in the progression of crises in recent years is leaving poorer countries further behind, adding to inequality. During COVID, most of the impact of accommodative fiscal and monetary policies was felt in advanced economies. Increasing amounts of global capital were allocated to a narrow group. While this policy accommodation has been increasing for years, concentrating wealth, the misallocation accelerated dramatically during COVID, leaving demand elevated and supply chains constrained. On the fiscal side, governments borrowed heavily from savers around the world to support consumption, leaving shortages of capital for growth and investment, especially in developing countries. Almost all the fiscal stimulus went to benefit people in advanced economies, often people with incomes well above the median. On the monetary side, the major central banks moved further away from monetarism. Some entirely removed the reserve requirement on banks, adopting a post-monetarist framework in which central banks both regulate and allocate capital rather than controlling the money supply through bank reserves. The regulatory framework has the explicit bias that debt of advanced country governments is considered zero risk, while other debt, especially that of small businesses, developing countries, or new entrants, is treated as risky and requires costly bank equity capitalization. Separately, the purchase and ownership of bonds by central banks allocates capital from small bank accounts to bond issuers. The result is to increase asset prices in overcapitalized sectors of the advanced economies. From an inequality standpoint, this framework misallocates capital, favoring those with higher net worth at the expense of broad-based growth. If the anti-inflationary policies getting underway now are primarily achieved through interest rate increases, it risks deepening the inequality problem. Stagflation could worsen, exacerbated by shortages of the working capital needed for small businesses and supply chains. There are important additional tools available to policymakers as they combat inflation, including: 1, encourage a supply response to counteract price increases. Markets are forward-looking, so even the announcement of future supply would help. Unfortunately, many of the policy announcements being made go in the opposite direction. Number 2, in the advanced economies, reduce government spending and target it more for those most in need. This would reduce non-productive demand and allow global capital markets to focus on supply chains, taking pressure off inflation. 3rd, reduce central bank bond holdings. This would allow more capital to flow to other assets, such as the short-term floating rate capital needed by smaller businesses to increase global output. And 4th, perhaps most important, link all these steps to the goal and expectation of enhancing growth, increasing global supplies, and assuring currency stability. This would make clear and explicit the distinction between the current price surge and the severe stagflation of the 1970s that followed the 1971 global currency devaluations. To confront these overlapping crises, the World Bank Group is preparing a 15-month crisis response envelope of around $170 billion for the period from April 2022 through June 2023. Part of this surge in financing is aimed at global public goods, activities that benefit all countries. These include climate change, food security, refugee flows, and health preparedness. Consider the massive and complex challenge of climate change. Our Climate Change Action Plan is built on the integration of climate and development by identifying the major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, developing often complex, multi-decade projects that will have the most impact, and working with the global community to fund them. Last year, the World Bank Group provided over $26 billion for mitigation and adaptation efforts in developing countries, more than half of all the multilateral financing in this area. More than 2 years into the COVID crisis, it is devastatingly clear that broad-based participation in global public goods is necessary, whether for climate change, COVID-19 vaccines, refugees, or future pandemic prevention and preparedness. The kind of, the bell tolls. The kind of investment required for a comprehensive approach to global public goods is far beyond the current capacity of governments and international financial institutions. Private capital has expressed a welcome interest in funding climate change investments, but many of the most impactful will be unprofitable and, in fact, costly. We've proposed various models to pool the funding and make it available for the most impactful climate change projects. Financing the global public goods agenda is a discussion that we welcome and have engaged in comprehensively. The major new challenges facing the world make clear that the problems, solutions, and financing for them will have to go beyond national borders. This is especially apparent for developing countries that, in many cases, are facing the biggest problems despite having the least national resources. I would be remiss in this setting not to mention the World Bank Group's partnership with Switzerland. It has been a steady partner for us, and I'm pleased to commemorate the 30th anniversary of Switzerland's membership in the World Bank. Moments like this require strong partnerships that can withstand tough times. Switzerland is a valued, active shareholder and partner of the World Bank Group through its thought leadership, knowledge, and financial support. This partnership is generating results that improve lives in low and middle-income countries. Switzerland recently pledged $724 million at IDA's 20th replenishment. It is the 10th largest contributing partner to IDA since inception. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Swiss government and all Swiss stakeholders for their support and trust. I would also like to recognize the constructive policy dialogue over the years in key areas such as jobs and economic transformation, private sector development, climate fragility, the humanitarian development nexus, crisis preparedness, good governance, and digital development. I look forward to the day, and hope it will be soon, when the fighting has stopped in Ukraine and the World Bank Group helps the Ukrainian people achieve peace, stability, and growth. As we plan for that day, we must work in parallel to address the world's other development crises, the worsening inequality and instability, the catastrophe of higher food and energy prices, the overhang of debt, and the importance of global public goods such as climate mitigation and adaptation. Getting there will take concerted action by governments, international institutions, and the private sector, and will rely on strong relationships like the World Bank Group's partnership with Switzerland. The World Bank Group will continue to work urgently to address these overlapping crises and, as Churchill so eloquently said in his speech here in 1946, help people across the globe regain the simple joys and hopes which make life worth living. With that, thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. President, thank you so much for your interesting presentation. You mentioned all the challenges and tasks the World Bank has and is facing today, including Ukraine and many others. You also mentioned the 30th anniversary of Switzerland joining the World Bank. I remember well, we have referendums about everything here in Switzerland. We had a referendum about that too. I remember well because the IDA credit was also up for referendum, and I have an aunt who's called IDA as well, and I was always wondering why she needs a credit and a loan in those. But that's something. No, that was and the Swiss population voted in favor of joining the World Bank. We will have now the opportunity to ask questions or make comments to the presentation by the
May I
president.
say the referendum process is really powerful, and IDA stands for the International Development Association, and it gives grants and very low interest rate loans to the poorest countries around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I might start maybe the first question, then I come up there. We've seen COVID. We have seen a growing tendency of nationalism. We see problems in international transportation. Did we go too far with globalization? Do you think we have reached the top and we have now to reduce this dependency on others and maybe go back to more homegrown activities?
I think trade is really powerful. If we think about economic development, it starts from people trading things and specializing, and that goes between people in their neighborhoods, people in their villages, people across within their region, and across national boundaries. So globalization is an extension of that. So my view is that it's a necessary part of economic development. So then the question is, well, is it a good idea to be heavily dependent on sole source suppliers? Businesses know the answer to that. They try to have diversified supply chains. And so I think that's the logical way to think about globalization. If that leads you to have supply chains that are nearer to home, maybe that's one answer. It depends on the cost of transporting things. There'll be a calculation by businesses around the world of how diversified do they want to be, how can they afford to be. I do think the world became overly dependent on China as the core of so many supply chains, and clearly became overly dependent on Russia for energy. And so the world's trying to think of or trying to work through the reduction in dependency on those two. I've argued and will argue that for China this is actually a beneficial step in that it too wants to diversify its supply chains and its customers. And so that can work. That should be a natural part of the way the world system evolves, to have less dependency on single suppliers.
Okay, thank you very much. I saw a hand up there. Yes, dear, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President, for a great presentation and for answering my question before I asked it. I always thought that peace would be guaranteed among clients. Clients would become friends, and globalization is going into that direction. Well, we see in the crisis of Ukraine that it is exactly the opposite result. The dependency of Western Europe to the goods of Russia is blocking them. Does it mean, in your mind, that globalization has severe limits and we should not invest too much in it?
I don't think that's my conclusion. You mentioned Henry Kissinger had given one of these lectures, so I want to use that term, realpolitik, that the reality of the world is there are some autocrats in the world. Not everyone is operating under a referendum system as Switzerland does, where people express their views and the nation moves in that direction. That's not the rule for some parts of the world. And so I think we just have to say globalization makes sense, makes the most sense if there are clients, customers, and suppliers trading with each other, and they will basically make good decisions. But we have to be wary of autocracies.
There is a question, please, this lady here, yes.
Many thanks for your very useful account of the current situation. I would have a question about your statement concerning the projects that we should turn to have an impact on climate change. You said that the most impactful projects would happen to be the least profitable. So what projects would you recommend the world to work upon, and how do you think we could reconcile the approach of different countries which are completely opposite? For instance, in France there is a nuclear power plants which make the requirement on fossil goods much less than Germany, who decided to go away from a nuclear plant. And you mentioned also Algeria, but Algeria alone is not going to accommodate the need of gas, of natural gas of all Europe. So I would really be interested in knowing what type of impactful projects, whether profitable or not actually, you would recommend.
Yeah. And one correction, I didn't say that the most profitable ones or the most impactful ones are the least profitable ones. So let me repeat the concept, that it's important to find impactful projects. Some of them will not be profitable. In fact, they'll be costly. And so the world community wants to find ways to fund projects that are costly, not just ones where the private sector can make a profit on them. And as far as which projects, I think the answer is actually relatively well-known. Methane leakage contributes methane, which is 80 times as powerful as carbon dioxide, and yet is leaking in many parts of the world. Gas flaring is one of the most impactful harms, and there are spots in the world where gas is being flared. Even in the United States, the North Slope of Alaska flares gas because there's not an alternative spot. There's no pipeline to use that energy to make fertilizer and crops and food for the world. It's a repeated problem, gas flaring. The World Bank works on that. We recently did a project through IFC in Iraq that is working to stop the flaring, and that saves a big chunk of greenhouse gas emissions. Other kinds of projects, coal-fired power plants have the combined problem of always being carbon intensive and also having severe health consequences. That's one of the major health problems in India is from the burning of coal. And so finding ways to shorten the life of old coal-fired power plants is one type of project that is important in moving in having impact. I could go on for quite a while, which I don't want to do, but efficiency itself is an important step. That means logical things that save energy, and that's been readily apparent. And World Bank had sizable programs in Ukraine and even before 2014 in Russia to try to improve energy efficiency because when the infrastructure gets old, it is very costly in terms of wasted energy. That's readily apparent also in the transmission of electricity. So when the transmission lines are not well maintained or are old, they lose power, they lose energy through the transition, and so that ends up being highly impactful in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. I don't mean to be exhaustive on this. There's land use is a huge part of the emissions problem, poor, improper land use, and that impacts countries in many parts of the world. You know the cases of Brazil, but there are many in Africa where land use reduces the carbon capture of the land, and so on down the list. So the point is that there needs to be an analysis. I was almost going to say careful, but it's really important to just do the analysis and then take actions on the impactful projects. The World Bank is part of the methane coalition that is working to reduce methane leakage, which is one of the most cost-effective. In that particular case, we just did a big report on it a month ago, it showed that many of the methane leakage fixes, repairs, are actually commercially viable. And so if they can be identified and if industry can get access to the pipelines, those can actually be commercially viable. But many of the other things that I mentioned are going to be costly, and that means, and that's part of the World Bank's endeavor to identify the projects and then to bring in the financing from the global community that's going to be needed. Thanks.
It looks like there are more and more, constantly more issues, problems, tasks piling up the World Bank has to address. Do you actually have enough money to do that? Or do we soon have to hold a new referendum in Switzerland?
I do want to say, you know, we have a very clear mission. It's to alleviate poverty and to boost shared prosperity. And shared prosperity is a broad term. It means the living standards of people in developing world. But if you think of that mission, it's focused enough. And so what we're doing, we're trying to be very creative with our financing techniques in order to try to have an impact and to get as much done as we can. The World Bank, people don't know, but is one of the world's biggest issuers of bonds. So we issue $100 billion per year of bonds that are used then for development purposes. They're sustainable development financing that then enables the capital, so the shareholders, such as Switzerland, to get as much impact from their contributions.
Do you pay any interest on that, on those bonds?
Yes, we do. And many of them are sold in Europe and many in Switzerland, and we welcome the clients. And you know, one new innovation over the last, 10 years or so is IDA itself issues bonds. So it is, which is very interesting. In other words, we've managed through great deal of care to be able to issue bonds into world investors, pay interest on those bonds, and then use that to help fund these grants and loans to the poorest countries. The trick, the ability to do that is in part because previous beneficiaries of IDA have been successful and are paying in the interest, which then helps pay for the bonds that new borrowers can take advantage of. And of course, vital in IDA is these new contributions that come in from Switzerland, but from countries around the world. The United States is the biggest contributor, and on down the list of major contributors, which include China, by the way, but very much the United Kingdom and Japan and Germany and so on. And we're grateful for that. And then that combination of donor contributions plus financing makes it possible. So the question was, is there enough money? Not at the World Bank, but we can have a big, as we've laid out, we're in the process of laying out a $170 billion plan, a commitment plan that addresses the problems that I tried to describe. It takes the work of lots of people in the World Bank, in country. We have a big presence. One of the changes under my presidency is to change to realign the staffing of the World Bank so that it's more physical presence in fragile countries, but also in developing countries in general, and less percentage-wise in headquarters in Washington. And it's working well because we build our programs up from the bottom, from the country level. So there's never enough money at the World Bank, but there's also, very importantly, the recognition that this is a global effort of the development agencies in countries around the world. I'll go tomorrow to Berlin and meet with the development ministers of the G7. This is the aid agencies of the bilateral aid agencies who are major partners of the World Bank. The civil society organizations like ICRC and World Food Program are important partners within this effort. So it's not, the World Bank's not doing it alone. It's a giant partnership.
Okay, thank you very much. There is a question far in the back, and then we come here to the middle ground here.
Thank you. President Malpass, thank you for being with us tonight. In the beginning of your presentation, you alluded to some of the pitfalls in banking regulations. The current spike in inflation has been used by some as an excuse to suggest the time to reform the global monetary system has come. What kind of changes does the World Bank stand for, if any? And on the banking regulation side, this topic, which is always at the frontier between art and science, what would you suggest in terms of how to improve it?
Thank you. Several parts of that. One is the immediate challenge facing the advanced economies in terms of their fiscal and monetary policy. And the World Bank puts out reports during the year on the economic prospects. One major one that we have is the Global Economic Prospects, GEP, that comes out twice a year and gives some sense of where the world economy is going. And that was the basis of the concern that I expressed here, that inflation is a hard problem. It really affects the poor. It's adding to the inequality of the world. And there should be, I hope the advanced economies will use all of their tools in combating the inflation. But other areas that the World Bank is very engaged in that are very important in this effort is the debt overhang. The use of debt for investment is a critical part of development. If we think about Europe's development, and Churchill was here speaking about it, it was vital that Europe was able to make heavy new investments in the 1940s, but particularly the 1950s and the 1960s. Lots of that was financed through debt because that brings together all the savers of the world together to do a project quickly and get it done. And so the developing world is sadly lacking in the amounts of investment that are needed. Part of that is the debt system. So I've spoken and advocated for changes in the debt system that is used for developing countries. There's an oddity within the international financial system. So, and you were asking about that, so I'll give you a specific. We have an imbalance in the system that favors creditors. That may have made sense at one point in history, but as we stand now, The problem that it causes is debtors don't have as good a legal advice. They don't have as clear a knowledge of contracts. Their governance systems in developing countries are not able to enter into contracts as careful a way as is needed in order to have functioning debt markets. And so I've advocated more transparency in debt contracts. I'll come back to that if I may, and also a better restructuring process. You know, in the corporate sphere, there's a bankruptcy process. Everyone's familiar with it. It's a key underpinning of the way the international financial system works. It's not available to countries. And so that means once they have an unsustainable debt, it goes on and on and on. There's not a process to unwind that problem. I'll come back to the contracts themselves. Many of the contracts being written now have non-disclosure clauses. Since 2014, China has routinely put non-disclosure clauses in its contracts, so people can't read the contract and see what the terms were and how it maybe could have been done differently. That's one. There's also collateral that's often in these sovereign debt contracts, which is against the good principles of infrastructure financing. There are escrow accounts which divert the payment flows. And so we've made specific recommendations on many of these that would, and the reason I'm talking about this, it's really important as the developing world tries to find ways to grow faster than the global average. In order to have successful development, you have to have people at the bottom grow faster than people at the top over a sustained period of time. That pulls them up or allows them to advance rapidly. And so, in order to do that, you have to have heavy investment into their businesses, into their infrastructure, and we need better debt markets in order to do that. So I'll make that point. And there are others in the international financial system, but those are two, I think, highlights that we should look at right now. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I saw a hand up here, please.
Thank you, President Malpass. I once worked as an intern in the Beijing office of World Bank Group, and during the internship, I really got a sense that the Chinese small corporation have the enthusiasm to go abroad and get globalization. But like during this COVID time, I know that the supply chains in China is now diverted to other countries. But for those vulnerable small corporations, what can the government or the World Bank Group do to help them to participate into the globalization or to achieve their goals in globalization? Thank you.
Thanks. Several points. Well, I want to make the basic point that as the world has developed over the last 30 years, one of the hallmarks was the decline in extreme poverty and in poverty. And one of the principal participants of that was China itself. The poverty that had been at high levels went down through successful economic development. It raised the median income of China through jobs, through investment, and the enthusiasm that you mentioned extended into China's activities outside of China. The challenge then becomes the interface of the systems. The China's system, as its economy has become the world's second biggest economy and growing at a steady, at a relatively fast rate. It's slowed recently substantially under the COVID lockdown. So as we look to the future, we want to find ways to inspire enthusiasm of investments and do it in a way that lines up with the rules and the processes that are going to be values-based around the world. We have with us Christine from OECD, this lady here. So OECD has an important set of principles for multinational engagement in investment. I would welcome, so a good starting point would be for China to join those principles and have systems that are comfortable to work with the world. I have argued and will argue that this is beneficial for China, that it creates a path forward where China can have an interface with the world and work to really expand global economic activity, and they would be a big participant in that expansion. But right now, we face difficulties along that interface, many different ones that the world is working on, and one particular one the World Bank works on is the debt interface, where many of the developing countries are left with contracts with China that are non-transparent and that are not, and there's not a global process to resolve those and restructure. So we've encouraged China to make progress on that and help the world find a process for restructuring debts in countries where the debt is unsustainable. Thanks.
Is there any process going on for a bankruptcy code for countries nowadays?
For
that
what?
Countries can go bankrupt? You said it's not possible so far, but maybe we could change that, or...
Working closely with the IMF, we have proposed a set of steps for the G20 that would make it more possible to restructure. One, for example, is that when a country is in an unsustainable debt situation, that there be a timeline for forming the creditors committee so that the debt can be known to the various creditors. That Chad has been at the G20 2 years ago, decided on a process. It took Chad well over a year for there to be reconciliation of the debts, even the knowledge of the debts. And we work with countries, including China, to try to reconcile the amounts of debt the amounts of debt that the country owes from its various borrowings. Anyone working in the bankruptcy process knows this is a common, important occurrence, that the creditors get together and reconcile the debts to see who thinks they're owed money, and then check it out, see, and quiz each other on that. That has been a very difficult part of the international process. So we're not at the point of recommending a bankruptcy process for countries, but rather a framework that strengthens the G20 framework and makes it effective.
Thank you. There was a hand here, please.
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. When I think about the past decades, much was invested in terms of institutions, in terms of organizations, to govern the world development, the globalization, the economical development, but also political stability. Now, in hindsight, when we look at the reality today, most of these tools actually were not effective at all to prevent what happened. And with that, a big topic comes into question, which is trust in these organizations to avoid this happening in the future. From your experience, what would you say in terms of what needs to be done differently going forward to ensure that and to make sure that this is a standard where everyone holds true and everyone holds accountable for?
Of course, this is a fundamental and very difficult question. It gets to the way people govern themselves through their associations and through their societies, through their mayors, through their the different levels of government. The rule of law becomes very important, and different peoples around the world have a different relationship with the rule of law and how you would describe it. Western civilization has the concept of a constitution, a Magna Carta, and a constitution that forms some relationship between people and their government. But different parts of the world have different views on that. So what we try to do at the World Bank is identify country by country what some of the shortcomings of governance are, how they can be strengthened. That means capacity building for institutions. But as your question brings out, this is a really broad area, and it hasn't been that successful. That's why developing countries have, in general, not been catching up, not been advancing. I can own, I have views on how to prioritize, but this gets into, I really think there needs to be country programs that make sense and that help the country itself within its society and within its framework make advances. As Europe thinks about its European Union and the governance within that presents clear challenges on how to strengthen that union, and that's going on every day in the newspapers. So it's not unique to developing countries. I guess, I'll go out on a limb. I'll say I have argued that it's very important that people have a relationship to their own money and currency. Currency stability is a starting point, and if you look at developing countries, oftentimes they break that pledge. If we think about the way countries were formed, including Europe was formed, the modern day Europe after the 1940s. So in the early 50s, currency stability became the cornerstone of the building of Europe and the creation of debt markets and credit and infrastructure and so on. So that's one, and that's a challenge for countries around the world. A notable, China in 1993 stabilized its currency. It was a step that Russia, Soviet Union, was never able to achieve. So they went through the whole Soviet Union to the end without being able to have money that the people could value. So all the history of the gray market and counter trade and the various methods that the Soviet Union used to try to keep people away from actual stable money. It was at the core of the unification of Germany in 1989, 1990 was that, in China in 1993. So I just mentioned those as one part of people's relationship. Even that one is super complicated. El Salvador a year ago decided it was going to make Bitcoin legal tender, which set it off on a tangent that is not working out well for them. And so we can have both sympathy for people in developing countries that don't have access to that, but it extends. I'm sorry, but to go on, but this is really important. The relationship to the World Bank works heavily in gender areas because the relationship of the law to women and to girls within economies becomes a really important part of how they build societies. We argue strongly that unless women are included in their societies, how can a country advance and develop if half of their population is left out of the legal structure of inheritance laws, of job finding capabilities, and on across the array of governance. World Bank has a big governance practice, but I have to say it's as broad kind of as my answer, because each part of what countries do has to be affiliated with what the norms are or what the history of that country is. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mr. Malpass. We have been grilling you for a long time. I think we have to come to an end, and I would like now to hand over the microphone to Romeo Lacher, the chairman of the bank.
Dear Mr. President Malpass, Your Excellencies, dear distinguished guests and friends, first of all, thanks a lot for your most inspiring and insightful speech, and also for the time you spent with us answering our questions. As the war in Ukraine feels so nearby here in Europe, and as we worry about the immediate and devastating consequences for the Ukraine and its neighboring countries, we tend sometimes to forget the dramatic implications for people in developing countries. So the rise in food and commodity prices, for example, is putting huge pressure on economies with a disproportionate burden on the poorest. This in turn makes it harder for government to meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals and risks to slowly down the necessary transition to a low carbon and sustainable future. The World Bank plays a key role in this context, and I'm proud that Switzerland, which is celebrating this year the 30-year membership in the World Bank, which is one of the reasons you're going to visit as well, I think, in early autumn, Switzerland again. In 1992, Switzerland, as Andreas Kalder has mentioned, approved with 56% pro votes to the accession of Switzerland to the World Bank and the IMF. The world was a very different place. The Soviet Union just has collapsed. The role of China and other emerging economies was only a fraction of what it is today, and Switzerland has not even been or have not even become a member of the United Nations. So the world has dramatically changed over the last 30 years, but your speech today made it very clear, more than ever, we need multilateral cooperation to address the global challenges we face today. In a way, this relates very much to the speech of Winston Churchill here in Zurich, where he called for a united European response to the challenges that the continent was facing back then. Switzerland, as a relatively small and neutral nation, has a natural position as a bridge builder between nations, and this is how we see our role in the World Bank. Furthermore, your institution is also an important partner for Switzerland to achieve the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Dear Mr. President, I would like to thank you wholeheartedly for being here with us tonight. Ideally, we will no longer need an institution like the World Bank Group one day, but we all know, and you confirmed this in your speech tonight, that this is most likely an illusion, at least for the foreseeable future. Dear guests, we are at the end of another Churchill lecture, and Julius Baer is proud to be a partner of these events. Today, more than ever, we need to stand up and talk about the values of freedom and democracy, about security and prosperity. I would like to thank you very much for attending tonight our event, and I do hope to welcome you soon to the next Churchill lecture. Thank you very much.